I believe the fundamental religious truth of the idea that life is suffering. It's suffering because we're mortal and fragile, and because we're also subject to malevolence at our own hands and at the hands of others. It's a constant existential problem. And that can make you bitter and can make you hopeless and nihilistic and depressed and anxious and likely to abuse substances of various sorts as a medication or an escape. It can augur you in a very large number of ways. And I'm suggesting to people that there is a way out of that. And the way out is to confront that forthrightly and to adopt responsibility in your own life and to try to make the world a better place, and that it's necessary to do that. And that if you don't do that, that things go badly. And it's a relief to people to hear that because they know it. They already know it.
So get a grip on yourself.
Well, it's more find something in your life that's so worthwhile doing that the fact that you're going to suffer is justifiable.
But if that something of value were, for instance, for someone to decide that they are a radical feminist or a radical trans campaigner, that would be something of great value in their lives. But these are not positions that I think you think have been
it's
hugely
generally
helpful.
Not of great value in their life, because what they're doing is abdicating their personal responsibility to live by their own truth, let's say, to adherence to an ideology. And I'm not a fan of ideologies. I think they're unbelievably dangerous. And I don't really care whether they're on the left or the right. So to be a feminist or a trans activist or to adopt that group-fostered view of the world, I think is generally a mistake. And I don't think it does people any good. Not usually. And it also allows them to adopt, and this is something else that's gone very wrong with our political discourse, is that it allows people to adopt an unearned sense of moral superiority and also of omniscient knowledge, because an ideology offers you that. And there's just nothing in that's helpful.
So what
it
you
just
have
fragments people.
But then what you have isn't an ideology, or
no, it's not an ideology. And
isn't a strong collection of ideas in a sense always an ideology?
No, it's not. It's not. And it's a mistake to think that way, because all that means is that the way that you construe the world is a battleground between different ideologies. And if an ideology is only that which serves a power elite, let's say, which is part of the postmodern neo-Marxist construal, then all it ever is a battle of opinions. And there's nothing underneath that. And it's all power. And that's just not an appropriate way of looking at the world. First of all, there's lots of forces at play that aren't mere power. Competence is one of them, assuming that there are some things that are worthwhile doing. And then with regards to ideology, I wrote a book about that. The first book I wrote is called Maps of Meaning. And it's a description of the relationship between archetypal or mythological thinking, proper religious thinking, I would say, and the parasitical structures that emerge from that, which are basically ideologies. And they can be technically differentiated.
What do you make of liberalism?
I would consider myself a classic liberal.
You would consider yourself a classic liberal?
Yes, although...
Which is also has beliefs attached, right? It comes out of a tradition of evolution of beliefs, but there is also a radical liberalism, isn't there, which feeds into feminism, which believes that progress is a better thing than lack of progress. I mean, the Economist is founded on those basics, and that people can argue about what they want to take or leave. But do you include then liberalism as one of the isms that you would say is in crisis at the moment, or has got itself into a mess?
Well, it depends to some degree, as you pointed out, on how you define liberalism. But one of the things that I like about the classic liberal take on the world, to which I think we owe Britain a great debt of gratitude for developing, perhaps more particularly than any other country, is that the individual is to be regarded as the sovereign entity in the political understanding. But that's not really a political claim. It's a claim that underlies politics. It's actually a theological claim. It's derived from the Judeo-Christian tradition. And because in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the suffering individual is the sovereign entity. And we established a political system based on that metaphysical axiom. And so I would say that to the degree that liberalism acts out the idea of the sovereignty of the individual, it's not an ism, it's not a political stance. It's far deeper than that, what it's predicated on. And the idea of the sovereignty of the individual is an idea that emerged with great difficulty over tens of thousands of years or longer than that. It has an immense developmental history that radically predates, let's say, the Enlightenment or any articulated political beliefs. It's far deeper notion than anything that can be encapsulated politically.
But if we look at some of the great classic liberals of the 19th century, and we look back to Mill, for example, you have individual liberty very strongly in there from Locke onwards, a sort of the sense of sovereignty, and no one from the monarch down has the right to unfair sovereignty over another man or woman. But you also have a strongly kind of progressive sense that develops as liberalism develops and takes you towards women's franchise, towards, actually in Mill's case, a fairly out there feminism. If J.S. Mill was sitting here instead of me, would you be seeing eye to eye on whether that was a good idea?
Well, again, I think it depends on what you mean by feminism. I mean, the idea that it would be a good thing for the world to arrange itself so that the talents of women were as available to use by the collective, let's say, by the group or by society as the talents of men, then obviously that's all for the good. I don't have any problem with that whatsoever, because talent's in short supply, and it's a foolish society that wastes it no matter where it manifests itself. Racial divisions or ethnic divisions or any of that, equality of opportunity. I can't see how you can be a sensible person and not
do you
possess...
think do women have opportunity? Sorry, do women have equality of opportunity then broadly across Western societies?
Compared to what?
Compared to not having equality of opportunity.
Well, compared to 100 years ago, yes. Compared to 50 years ago, yes. Compared to most places in the world throughout history, yes. Compared to a hypothetical ideal, no. But I'm not
would that
very, very
hypothetical
leery.
ideal be a good ideal or a bad ideal?
Well, it depends on how you define equality. If you define it as equality of outcome, then it's a catastrophic ideal. See, this is something too. One of the things I've been struggling with recently is the idea of boundaries, let's say. We know absolutely, and this is relevant to your questions on progressivism, we know that the left can go too far, and we know that the right can go too far. I mean, I would say that's the abject lesson of the 20th century. Both can go too far. And we kind of know when the right goes too far. We probably think the right goes too far, if you had to boil it down to one thing, when people start making claims of racial or ethnic superiority. That seems to be the marker. But we don't know when the left goes too far. And the left, to be frank about it, isn't very careful about differentiating itself into those who are pursuing a reasonable progressive agenda and those who have seriously gone too far. And I would say that when people push an equality of outcome agenda, they've gone too far. Even though it's not as blatantly horrifying, let's say, as claims of ethnic or racial superiority, the consequences of playing that idea out in the world are seriously not good.
But surely they are, they're two kind of doorstops at the far ends of the arguments. I mean, very few people, I think, on the left, and there would be some who would advocate for absolute equality of outcome and everything it would take to achieve that.
It's not so clear to me
Similarly,
that that's a minority view.
There may be lots of things that are wrong both on the left and on the right that don't involve the right being overtly racist and the left wanting absolute equality of outcome. It's a space surely in the middle that matters, and that's why I suppose people feel that sometimes your argument is almost sort of, it's driving towards picking the fight rather than liberalism would, I suppose, encourage you to take the best, and we can have the argument about what's the best and what's the worst of everything that's in between.
No,
I
think that the left poses a far greater danger than your analysis suggests. I certainly see this in the universities. And the drum is being beat very, very hard, perhaps not so much here, but in North America, for equality of opportunity or equality of outcome under the rubric of equity. And equity is essentially a doctrine that fosters the notion that equality of outcome is not only desirable, but should be pursued as an object or as an explicit aspect of public policy. The idea being that if there isn't equivalent representation of all possible groups at all possible levels of all possible hierarchies, that indicates a tyrannical prejudice that needs to be rooted out. And that's having an absolutely pernicious effect on institutions, especially educational institutions in North America. It's an increasingly widespread view, and I think it poses far more danger than you think.
Is it possible that views become more attractive when something is dissatisfied and when aspirations have not been met which are reasonable aspirations to have? And you can then say that the answers are wrong or that they distort.
Sometimes.
But so I was trying to say, if this is such a popular view, to cite your example on campuses in North America, it may be that there's something out there that existing society has not satisfied.
What hasn't satisfied the ever-present human tendency towards envy and resentment, that's for sure.
So that's all that's driving it.
Not all, but it's a tremendous amount of what's driving it, and an absolute lack of gratitude for what we've managed to accomplish and what we have in front of us. I mean,
unfairness, does that figure?
Well, unfairness is a very ill-defined term. I mean, it's not so obvious either. It's not so obvious what's fair. So, for example, I got embroiled in a dispute the last time I was in the UK about the issue of the gender pay gap. And, from a social science perspective, the idea of the gender pay gap is it's so poorly formulated that it's almost staggering to me that people can even conceptualize it in this manner. It's not a univariate problem. It's a multivariate problem. Men and women don't make the same amount of money. So we can break it down
and then we can go through
No, not only could we have to.
Good.
And we can't assume that just because in all situations women don't make as much money as men, although there are some situations in which the reverse is true, by the way, that the reason for that is prejudice and oppression. There's many reasons for it. One reason, so there's a book by Warren Farrell, for example, called Why Men Make More, and he outlines like 42 reasons why men make more money than women. One of them is that men are much more likely to take dangerous occupations.
Well, let's have a go, if not at 42, at some of the reasons. But perhaps just start by talking a bit more about gender with you, that unfraught territory, which always seems to go well. Do you agree with people who hold that broadly gender is a social construct?
No.
I
don't hold with those people at all.
Why? Yes.
Well, because first of all, that's an axiomatic pronouncement rather than a consequence of the analysis of the empirical data. And I mean, what do you mean a social construct? Genitalia aren't a social construct. Differences in height aren't a social construct. Differences in weight aren't a social construct.
What we deduce from our genitalia is to an extent constructed, right?
Well, because there's environmental and cultural effects on anything that's complex, and that's certainly the case. And differentiating what those are is a very difficult thing to do. But the psychometric work on that has already been done and done well. And
what do you mean by the psychometric work?
I mean, psychologists in particular have spent 40 years sorting out an empirically derived model of personality. That's the Big Five model, which is well accepted among personality psychologists in the mainstream, most of who lean left, by the way, by an overwhelming majority. So there's no right-wing
conspiracy. It's a taxonomy, right? It might be five, it might be six. I mean, they could be wrong.
Yeah, but one of the things that's interesting about the taxonomy is that it was a-theoretically derived. It's purely a consequence of statistical analysis. And so
I'm not sure where that's taking us on how far gender is socially constructed.
So the first thing to do is to figure out what the parameters are when you talk about something like gender. So the parameters are, say, parameters of temperament, because you said, well, we're not going to talk about the biology, we're going to talk about what's derived from that. So we might say temperament. Okay, so we know the temperamental dimensions. We know that they differ between men and women, and they differ cross-culturally. But more importantly, this is the crucial distinction.
Well, we don't know, because, I'm just looking at a piece of recent research on the brain, which concludes there are not two types of brain, and there are other researchers.
Who did the research?
No, it's the New Scientist. Scans prove there's no such thing as the male or female brain, just so you know what you're dealing with.
Nobody who has any sense would ever claim that there was a male and female brain.
Okay.
These differences aren't absolute.
But do you want to, so shall we just take that as a question? Do you want to engage that question on two types of brain, and then we can be a bit clearer on the question?
Well, there aren't two types of brain, and men and women are more the same by personality than they are different by a substantial margin. There's more similarity than difference.
If there's more similarity than difference.
But that doesn't mean the differences are irrelevant. So let me give you an example. Right. So if you pick two people at random out of the population and had to guess who was more aggressive, and you guessed the man, you'd be right 60% of the time. That's about the magnitude of the difference between men and women.
Well, that's 60-40. It's not that much of a margin,
right.
is it?
That's exactly right. But, and this is where things get more sophisticated. All right, so then imagine that you had to pick the 1 in 100 most aggressive person and put them in jail, which is what we do. They're all men. So even though at the midpoint, the difference between men and women isn't that extreme, at the extremes, the difference is extraordinary. And most of the activity, or much of the activity in complex situations, happens at the extremes. So men are more interested in things than women are, and women are more interested in people than men are, on average. And those differences are largest in Scandinavia, by the way. So there's no evidence that they're socioculturally constructed. And one of the consequences of that is that if you leave men and women to make free choices...
Well, let's put aside that Scandinavia is not just one country, and it has lots of different cultural, political differences within
Sure, but the
Scandinavia,
point is that, and this is the fundamental point, is that the more egalitarian the country, the bigger the differences between men and women. The bigger.
I have no idea how one could possibly
conclude
order that.
You rank order countries by their sociocultural policies, from egalitarian to non-egalitarian, and then you look at the magnitude of the differences in temperament in men and women in those countries. And you do those analyses
depending on your
publish
definition
them.
of temperament.
Yeah, but there isn't a definition of temperament that exists that's valid outside of the psychometric community.
Well,
and so this is
in that case, we're
science.
locked into a particular definition within what you call the psychometric community. And other people may simply say, look, I experience the world very differently, and I have evidence from my dealings, whether I'm a man, whether I'm a woman, whether I'm looking at how we get along together and what we do to improve matters, that doesn't conform to that. I mean,
the question is then, what is the evidence? The fact that someone has an opinion about it isn't relevant. The relevant issue is what the evidence suggests, unless you're willing to throw out the scientific enterprise, which I wouldn't recommend.
No, I'm not. I'm certainly not doing that. But I do think that to pin it to a narrow definition of psychometric testing
it's not narrow. It's five-dimensional.
Recursive.
It's five-dimensional. It's not narrow. The whole world only has 4 dimensions. 5-dimensional model is actually extraordinarily sophisticated.
If it's got 4 dimensions and then we're into 5, that's magic.
Well, you have 5 dimensions. There's many multi-dimensional spaces, but reality itself has 4 dimensions, and there's plenty of complexity.
Let's come back to your evidence. Absolutely come back to evidence, but also to what you make of the evidence, because trading.
All I make of the evidence is that there's multiple reasons for gender differences.
So what do we then do with this? Let's say that we decide that there are differences, and we can argue whether it's about the average. I mean, who is the average woman? Am I the average woman? Are you the average
in some ways, probably. In other ways, not.
Right. Okay. Good to know. So what do we do with this? So it takes us into this argument about what progress should look like. And the gender pay gap was a good example of that. As you say, lots of different ways of describing it, lots of different approaches to dealing with it. The challenge to you would still be, I think, do you think that the situation that we have is broadly fair in workplaces, and that women are self-selecting out of progress up the pay chain, rather than being, to an extent, under either pressure of child rearing that is not probably accounted for, or that they're not properly helped with? Is it really all about their decision, or might structures not play a role here? One doesn't have to be completely mad to think this, right?
No. What you have to be completely mad is to reduce the whole thing to gender and to assume that it's a consequence of oppression. There's multiple factors at play, and prejudice is one of them. The question is to what degree prejudice, or arbitrary categorization, let's say, and the lack of provision of opportunities for women is contributing to the pay gap, and to what degree other factors are contributing. So there's other factors. Like I said already, men are much more likely to do dangerous jobs. They're also more likely to do jobs that scale. So, for example, because women are more interested in people on average than men are, they tend to work in people-oriented enterprises, and those are hard to scale. And because you can't scale them, it's harder to multiply the income. Men are more likely to move than women are. Men are more likely to take on trade positions. They're more likely to work with heavy machinery. They're more likely to work outside. All of these things add to the...
But if you cashed out, sorry to interrupt you there, but if you took out working with heavy machinery, which some women do, but more, we will say, right, more men will elect to do that. There's quite a lot of things in there where they're being nudged. We're all nudged throughout our life to certain choices. We don't have to accept the nudge. But then would you accept that women have lacked opportunities, that they've lacked? The nudge has not operated in the same way. So for you to say, end up...
Over what time span?
Well, you can choose your time span. Say 100 years if you like.
I would
don't
say
really mind the time span. The point is, are women, in a sense, already going through a number of gates in life, and some of them are wider than others?
It's complicated. I mean, I think men were directed down narrow pathways in ways that women weren't. So, for example, they were much more likely to be conscripted into wars, for example, which actually happens to be a non-trivial phenomena, because it resulted in the deaths and the demolition of many men. And so both sexes are subject to the arbitrary strictures of culture. And perhaps you could argue that women had the worst time of it, although it's not that easy an argument to make. I would say that the extra pressures of child-rearing and the inevitability of pregnancy played a very large role in that, and we didn't deal with that effectively till 1960. And so one of the things that I really don't like about the women were oppressed by men throughout history narrative is the fact that both men and women were terribly oppressed by nature throughout history, and that's not being factored into the equation. And I think that what men and women did for most of history, the decent ones anyways, was team up and partner up and try to make life the least amount of miserable for both. And yet we read this narrative backwards and we say, well, the reason that men and women weren't operating equally in the sociocultural landscape was because men were oppressing them. It's like, sorry, no. That accounts for a tiny fraction of it or some proportion of it, but it had much more to do with the fact that everyone was poor and miserable and that women were locked into a reproductive cycle from which they had no practical escape. And we didn't fix that till the 60s.